Jung, Josh Gates, oh good, Josh, ask me an easy question. Jung suggested that the Christian myth failed to articulate Christ's descent into hell, and that this resulted in the mass shadow projection of the West. Thoughts? Yeah. Well, I'm going to refer to my book again. I talk about this in Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. In that chapter, I discussed there's this idea in Christianity that Christ took the sins of the world onto himself, and I think that's very much related to the idea of descent into hell. They're not exactly the same thing, but I'm going to address the first one, and it'll shed light on the second. So what does it mean that the Messiah is archetypally the figure who takes the sins of the world onto himself? What it means, practically speaking or psychologically speaking, and I've tried this with some of my clients who were very naive, it means to read the history of the world as if you were the perpetrator of the evils that you read about instead of the victim or the noble intervener. You know, I talked to somebody the other day about the movie Schindler's List, and Schindler was this German industrialist who saved a very large number of Jews that were in danger of the final solution. And one of the things he said was, well, you know, when people watch Schindler's List, they always think they'd be Schindler. And if they don't think they'd be Schindler, maybe they think they'd be the Jewish victim of the Nazis. But they almost never think that they'd be the Nazi persecutor. And that's a big mistake. Because when you read about history, then you're reading about you, even if the you is the perpetrator. And unless you understand that, then someone else has to be the perpetrator. And if someone else is the perpetrator, well, then you have a devil that you can chase. And, you know, maybe you've identified the devil properly because, you know, now and then it's like John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy or someone like that. And you've actually, you know, you've identified a perpetrator. But so often, far too often, the best way to constrain the malevolence outside is to constrain the malevolence within. And so if you don't have a locale for the evil of the world, then you have to externalize it because the evil of the world certainly exists. Now, it's a better solution to assume that you're fully capable of the terrible things that people have been capable of throughout the history of humanity and to contend with that genuinely. And there's massive advantages to that. I mean, first of all, it can actually produce an remarkable increment in self-esteem because, you know, if you're just a rabbit and you freeze whenever a wolf looks at you, then you're just a frozen rabbit, and that's not so good. You're just a scared rabbit. But maybe you learn one day that you're not a rabbit, that you're actually quite the damn monster, and you've got teeth and you could really use them in an underhanded and horrible way. This is why people like anti-hero movies so much, hey, because they go and see the villains, the mafia guys and these tough guys and the anti-heroes that populate our imagination, and they think, oh yeah, well, I'd really, really like to be someone like that. And the thing is that being useless and weak, it's better to be a monster than to be useless and weak. And that's because being useless and weak makes you a worse monster than a monster. That's why. It's not like being a monster is good, but weak, useless monster is the worst kind of monster because that's the sort of monster that'll jump you in the dark and sink its teeth into the back of your neck instead of confronting you forthrightly in the alley. And so if you start to see yourself as the perpetrator of historical malevolence, you know, if you can imagine yourself as an Auschwitz camp guard, if you see yourself as the vicious villain of the human story, then all of a sudden you've got a lot more respect for yourself and you can unlock that internal monster and then maybe you can tame the damn thing, or at least bring it into some sort of partnership with yourself. And then when someone pushes you around, you can let a little bit of that out in your eyes, just a little bit. And you can say, it would be better for you and for me if you didn't continue to do that. And you can actually mean it. And then actually it will stop, because if you let a little bit of that out, when you tell someone to stop, the probability that they'll stop is extremely high. And then just a tiny vision of the monster you could become is enough to keep order in your house, and maybe in your state. And so the mass shadow projection of the West. Well, you know, here's another thing. So one of the things the Christians figured out was that the snake in the Garden of Eden was also Satan. I can't get into that. It's too complicated. You'll have to read chapter 7 if you want a full explication of that idea. That's as good an answer to the question as I can manage tonight. I spent all day, let's see, all day. I got up at 7 and I worked all day till 5 on this video I told you about. So I made about 400 edits or something like that. So I'm a little bit on the burnt out side tonight. So let's see.